Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Obviously, we are recording this. The presentation, the primary presentation that I want to give you is one that I think needs to be heard by a wide variety of folks, and not just clergy, but laity as well. And so hopefully by getting this recorded and on our website and distributed however, whatever other means, we can get this word out. And I hope after we're finished, you'll understand why I think it merits that kind of distribution. So first of all, thanks for having me here. Tim, thank you for the invitation. I've met all of you now, but just in case, I'm Fred Hinz, formerly pastor at Emmanuel Lutheran Church and School in Gaylord, still live in Gaylord, have been on the district staff for, beginning my 5th year now. My role changed about a year ago, a little over a year ago. For the first 4 years or so, or 3.5 years, I served as one of the assistants to President Natesty, and in that regard had 2 primary roles. One was to act as a mission formation coordinator, essentially a consultant primarily to rural and small town congregations, primarily in the southwest and southeast corner of our district. But I also served as the public policy advocate at that time. About a year ago, I gave up the mission formation portion and took on a part-time status, which isn't really very part-time at all, but it allows me to focus almost entirely then on these public policy matters. And I think most of you are aware, maybe not, that I still am kind of a unique duck in the LCMS world. When I speak and tell people I am your public policy advocate, typically people's eyes kind of glaze over, and that's true for, whether it's pastor or laity, because they've never heard of such a thing. Because there has never been such a thing until President Natesty and the board of directors decided to bring it into being a little over 4 years ago. Because there is no other type of person like this, it has meant that we've kind of stepped into this or stumbled through this, or however you want to look at it, without any how-to manual. I think most of you know, particularly older folks, but I think all of us understand that LCMS has always been very cautious about the church body itself as an institution engaging in political matters. We have come up to that line in the past primarily on the life issues, but we've really not gone any further than that. Things have changed so dramatically in the culture around us that kind of an implementation of our two kingdoms theory, where we essentially we preach to our people, and then our people as individuals engage with the government, engage with the culture in general. While that worked very well, I think, for the first 150 years that LCMS was in this country at least, because of the changes in the structure of the culture, it doesn't work very well anymore. And so the decision was made that we need to add a more direct institutional engagement. And that's where I come in, and these kinds of presentations come in. So, before I get into the presentation itself, there are a couple of things that I want to cover with you. Probably 6 weeks ago, Billy and I put out another issue of our With One Voice for Public Policy e-newsmail. And was it about a month and a half ago? Maybe at least that. In that email, I said that I was actually fairly optimistic, or at least in relative terms, because there's some things going on that have not happened before, at least not in our lifetime. And those two things are, first of all, we are on the cusp. Well, we have already received some major positive news from the courts. And it's been a long time since we've been able to say that. But the court system has given us some rulings, and we're anticipating several more very positive rulings if the prognosticators are correct. This June should be, I hope, I pray, a time for celebration because of what will be given to us by the courts. There, of course, is the Masterpiece Cakes case that was argued before the court back in December. More recently, there was the Janus case, which may not seem like it has a lot to do with us, but it has to do with public employee unions, and in particular, teachers' unions, and their ability to wield an excessive amount of influence in our culture. And then more recently, just was it last week or the week before, the case that was argued, it goes under the acronym NIFLA, N-I-F-L-A, versus Becerra, he's the Attorney General for California. That was the case about whether the state could force citizens, in particular pro-life crisis pregnancy centers, whether they could force them to essentially advertise for abortion clinics and so forth. And again, judging from the way the arguments went, we anticipate a favorable ruling. All that's going to come out probably this June. So buckle your seatbelts and be ready to explain to your folks why these are such, Lord willing, such positive things. So that's one reason to be, I would say, on the upbeat side with respect to public policy. Another reason is because in the last 6 months, especially in the last 2 or 3 months, there have been some just wonderful books being published. As you well know, the church is not a nimble organization. You know, it takes us a while to respond to changes in the world around us. And so we are just now beginning to see Christian thinkers and writers responding to this wave of what shall we call them? Social novelties. Same-sex marriage, transgenderism, this kind of thing. And on the table, in front of one group anyway, are a number of these books. The big, thick one, if Ted, could you hold that up for me? It's entitled Theistic Evolution. It's an imposing thing from a physical point of view, if not otherwise. But it really is a wonderful resource. And what it does is to call us, as the Christian church, to begin to forcefully and confidently challenge those who claim to be part of the Christian church, but who nevertheless very boldly and brazenly advocate for Darwinian evolution, which from a scientific point of view, Darwinian evolution is dead. It has absolutely been discredited. Anybody who knows the field has long since given up arguing that mutations and natural selection, could produce what we see around us. And in fact, those folks who understand that, they're rather desperately trying to concoct some new replacement theory, anything other than to have to give credence to creation. And that's the best indicator that there is, that they've abandoned what they have, the ship that they've been riding for the last 150, 60 years, but they have nothing to replace it. And so the idea that science itself is giving an ever more robust witness to the creation, it should give us great encouragement, and it should give us that confidence that we need to challenge those who still advocate this thing called theistic evolution. I'm sure you've heard of it before. It is a complete oxymoron. You can't truly advocate for evolution because it clearly stipulates that there is no such thing as God, and still claim to be part of the church. So, at any rate, it's a great book. If you have interest in these areas, or if you have members who have interest in these areas, it's a great one to have. There are a number of other books there as well. The one that Ted's holding up now, called Love Thy Body, that's the most recent one that has come out, and I would advocate strenuously that you buy it and read it, because it, better than any other resource that I've seen, helps to make sense of all these social innovations that have been coming at us one after another. It ties it all together in a way that I think is really encouraging for us as Lutherans in particular. As the title indicates, there's an emphasis there on the bodiliness of the Christian message. What better time than Easter to call that to people's attention? We proclaim that not only did Christ physically, bodily die, but he physically, bodily rose, okay? And we will physically, bodily rise. We need to regain even greater confidence in speaking that, and this book will help do that. Nancy Piercy, the author of this one, she's written several other books over the last 20 years. Perhaps you've read one is Total Truth, and the other one had total in the title also. But at any rate, it's really excellent. She actually has some Lutheran roots, although I'm not sure she would claim them these days. But she writes with great clarity, and I think you would be blessed by the investment of time and energy there. Then there are several other books. One of them called Man Up. This is a new book produced by CPH and written by one of our fellow pastors, Jeff Hemmer. I think he's from Indiana. Just a wonderful explication of what a Christian view of masculinity is all about, and how important it is not to slide into this cultural quicksand, which essentially dismisses male and female, masculine and feminine, just totally blurs that, and expects that there will be no repercussions from that. It's really one that our church body can be proud of, and so I'd encourage you to read that. Then there's another one right in front of you, Ted, there. When Harry became Sally, remember the film When Harry Met Sally? Well, this is a focus on transgenderism, and again, the incongruities of that, how absolutely anti-scientific that is, the idea that one can morph from a male to a female or vice versa. Again, well written, and Ryan Anderson is the author there. He's Roman Catholic, but boy, he has produced just some excellent works. He has, several years ago, came out with one called What is Marriage? And he and Sharif Girgis, again, it's a wonderful resource for anybody, but especially for Christian pastors, I think. Yes?
Just a quick note. There is another book along the same lines as the Man Up one called Ladylike for the Ladies. Also
Yes. Yes. Ladylike. I know my wife has it and has read it, and she appreciates it. So, very good. Thanks. Okay. So at any rate, there's really good stuff there, but we need to be aware of it and to actually consume it, read it, and allow it to permeate in our preaching and teaching. And above all, it means placing a greater emphasis on the first article, on the physicality of the creation and the recreation. That we are going to, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, okay? So that we aren't tempted to spiritualize the gospel in a way that's really non-biblical. The last book I'll just very briefly mention, it's called, what is it called again? Moral Darwinism. This is actually quite an old book. It's approaching 20 years old, maybe not quite, but it is the best resource I've ever found to essentially demonstrate that the theory of evolution did not come into being because of scientific evidence that pushed people in that direction. Darwinian evolution came into being because it was a theological pre-commitment on the part of folks who had to find a way to get rid of God. And until they got rid of God, they were going to lead what they called a disturbed life. Because, of course, they didn't know, or they did know what was going to happen after death. And so it sets out just in as clear a way as I can imagine the fact that the Darwinian evolution, the theory was clearly stated 200-300 years before Christ. And the reasons that it was proposed were given clearly as well, and that is they were theological. It was then, of course, resurrected by Darwin a couple of thousand years later, or 1,500 years later. So anyway, some really positive resources for us to use. All right, but I'm here primarily to talk about one particular court decision that was reached not quite a year ago. But it's a court decision that has a profound impact, has already had a profound impact, and promises to have an even more profound impact in the future. I'm kind of assuming that you heard about this. It's called the Trinity Lutheran ruling, and it does indeed focus on one of our LCMS congregations. I'll give you more of the details of it a little bit later on. But what it promises is that there was going to be an entirely new landscape for education in this country, not just parochial education, which of course we have a particular interest in, but all forms of education, which right now are pretty much held captive to the secular left. And it promises, and this is the truly exciting part, new opportunities for us to proclaim the gospel that we haven't had for a long time. So, if you know anything at all about the Trinity Lutheran case, you probably remember that it has something to do with playgrounds. Everybody kind of that rings a little bit of a bell. And in fact, it is about playgrounds, which seems like kind of a trivial focus. But in fact, as is often the case, it is these trivial matters that most clearly set out some concepts, some principles, which then get applied to much less trivial matters. And so the Trinity case was about playgrounds, but it was also about parents, okay? And the place of parents, the authority that parents have in the lives of their children. It was about education, which I've already alluded to, and ultimately, for our purposes, it's about the gospel and our ability to proclaim it and the ability of the gospel to be heard. I wonder what we would do if, when we stepped into our pulpits next Sunday, if we saw 2/3 or 3/4 of the people sitting in front of you with earplugs in their ears, obvious earplugs, so that you could preach, the most wonderful gospel-centered, law gospel sermon that there ever was, but they literally could not hear it. Okay? In essence, that is the situation that we face, not because, of course, they have a physical impediment to hearing it, but because they have been inculcated with a worldview that does not allow them to hear what you're preaching, does not allow it to penetrate their worldview. That's what this is all about, allowing parents to be able to educate their kids so that they can hear the preached gospel. Okay? All right, so one way of wrapping all of this together is to say that this is all about parental choice in education. Now, because this case focused on a school, actually a preschool, and because some of the arguments about it revolved around education on different levels, the temptation is to say, well, this is all about education. Well, it's not. It is about religious freedom as it applies not just to schools, but to our congregations as well. And in fact, the first practical application of this new ruling had nothing to do with schools, but rather the churches themselves, congregations. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so why place so much emphasis on parents? Well, as is pretty obvious, parents are in fact the first and the primary educator of their children. In years past, that would have been a very uncontroversial statement. These days, it is controversial. In years past, everyone would have understood that educators, professional educators, possess the calling or the right to teach your children because they would have received that from the parent. Okay, the parent they have an authority to teach only because it's delegated by the parent. And in fact, in years past, we always crystallized that idea in this Latin phrase, in loco parentis. I remember when I was a kid in school, I heard that phrase with some regularity. And even as a kid, I grasp it. It says that teachers stand in place of, in locus, of the parent. Okay? That's being challenged very directly. And I'll tell you about a case that just came up about 2-3 weeks ago that demonstrates that a little bit. Also, parents are important because they have occupy a unique position where they can take into account the wide number of factors that have to be considered before it can be determined what the best kind of education is for a particular child. The state can assess some of those things, but there are things that parents alone are capable of factoring in. And then, of course, there's the simple fact that, which sociologists these days, everybody, whether they hail from the right side or the left side of the political spectrum, every sociologist these days will clearly stipulate that it is the strength of the family and the place of parents that ultimately produce a stronger or a weaker society. Okay? If parents do not parent well, families do not function well, and societies do not function well. So, okay, so because this is to a large degree, at least in the short term, about education, we should probably talk a little bit about what in fact education is, or what its goals are. How do you know when you have been well educated? How do you know if you have received a good education? Well, a lot of people will say, well, you've received a good education if in the end you produce good workers. If the product of the educational process can fit into the economic engine, if they can hold down a job and be productive in the economy, then they have been well educated. And I, for one, will not argue with that. That is an important function of education. Others will say, well, that there's another goal to be had in education, and that is to produce good citizens. Particularly in a democracy, you can't maintain that democracy in any kind of a healthy form unless people are well educated. Okay? So these two things are the things that you will hear about most often in let's say, the secular media. When they want to assess, is education in the United States going well or not, they will focus on these two things, and usually it's on the first. Are people capable, are students capable of entering the job market and functioning well? And in fact, these two things, producing good workers and good citizens, these are two legitimate interests that government has in education. They are the only two interests, legitimate interests, that government has. But we don't want to be dismissive of that. It is important. However, education is a whole lot more than just producing good workers and good citizens. One of the ways of conceiving of what a good education is to use this metaphor, this construct. Education could be described as a process by which a child's world is framed. Okay? Now, here we've got a good example. You got a great big wall, okay? Nice slate gray wall. There's a picture on that wall, but that picture would pretty much get lost there if it did not have a frame around it. A frame gives it definition. It calls our attention to what's inside of it. It tells you that what's inside of it is the important thing and not what's around it. So an education also is that process by which we help children understand, first of all, what's real and what isn't, and what is important and what is not. But then there are a whole lot of other things too. Education ultimately leads somebody to understand whether there is such a thing as purpose in life. Okay? Does your life have a purpose? Okay? When that is unanswered, or when the answer is no, I have no purpose, then what happens? What's happened in the last roughly 5 years? The suicide rate has risen dramatically. I don't know if you've seen recent news stories on that, but it's quite shocking what's happened. That, among other reasons, has to do with whether people have a sense of purpose or not. Education also will help students understand or answer the question, is life, is the world as a whole, is it something that is designed, or is it something that has occurred by accident? Is it just a chaotic process that has produced, these wonderful things called bodies and, everything else around us? An education will help to determine whether there is such a thing as good and bad or not, whether there is such a thing as right and wrong, whether the universe is just made of physical stuff or if there was more. It will help answer the question, what is a human person? Are we, in fact, just physical stuff? That's what materialism tells us, okay? And that's what kids have been fed, a steady diet of that for generations now. And we wonder why we're having trouble, with people coming and attending church at all or regularly, okay? Because they're carrying this in their head, that the only real stuff in the world is physical stuff. And you, pastors, are up there yapping away about some other stuff, which as far as they're concerned is just fantasy. Okay? Are we composed of body and soul? And if so, are they both necessary? Or is one more important than the other? Sometimes we use, instead of the word soul, we'll use spirit, okay? That's more acceptable to a secular hearer. What is the real you, the real person? Are you this integrated body and soul, or are you primarily just a spirit, and your body is just this shell in which your spirit dwells for a period of time? But the body is really very dispensable, okay? We've seen the outworking of that in same-sex marriage, in transgenderism, in all of these novelties. What they all have in common is the commitment that the body is essentially meaningless. The real you is your spirit, okay? And until we begin to understand that that's what people are now carrying in their head, that the body is an essentially meaningless thing. First of all, it makes the resurrection, the bodily resurrection from the dead, seem again to be kind of fantastical and be dismissed. And it means that they have no expectation that they too will be bodily raised from the dead. All of these things are dependent on the kind of worldview that people hold, and that worldview comes from their education, okay? And then finally, from our point of view, ultimately, is God inside the frame of reality or outside? Okay? That's critical. Education is going to answer that question. In fact, every educational system does ask and answer each of those questions. Okay? It's not like you can have an educational program that just avoids those. They may want to claim that, but that you can't have an education without addressing those fundamental issues. All right, so then the question becomes, well, who gets to decide which the correct answers are? Are we just physical, material, or do we have a soul? If we have both, which is more important? Are they both necessary, or can we look at the body, the physical stuff, as being inferior? Okay? Many of you, of course, will recognize this as the old Gnostic heresies. But they're back with a vengeance, of course, in our day and age. So, who gets to decide on the correct answers, and who will deliver those answers to your kids? Because very often, it's not just the content, it's the one delivering the content that is critical as well. Well, across history, there have always been two primary candidates for the who here, okay? Either parents are the ones who decide which the correct answers are and decide who will deliver those answers to their kids, or who else? The state, of course. Now, if you go far enough back in history, of course, back to the Greek city-states and so forth, there you had some examples of where the state literally did claim authority over the child, ownership over the child. Practically from the time they were weaned, they were removed from the parents and placed into a system, a state-sponsored system that would form those children into what they felt was the best citizen that they could, okay? In more recent times, especially here in the United States, we have never felt that the state was particularly intrusive on that count until recently. And that is changing very, very quickly. In fact, back in February of this year, in the state of Ohio, I don't know if any of you heard about the parents who had a middle-aged teenager who claimed to be transgender. The parents refused to allow the child to enter into the typical regimen of puberty blockers and then surgical transitioning from one to the other. The parents felt, not just on religious grounds, but on scientific grounds, that this was very dangerous and something that they would not consent to. That child and friends took that to the courts, and what happened this last February is that the courts removed that child from the home and gave the custody to, in this case it was grandparents, but the key thing is gave that custody to people who would allow that transitioning to take place. Even though, again, on scientific grounds, there is no reason that you should allow that kind of wild experimentation on people, because that's what it is at this point. So at any rate, the state now has in fact stepped up and begun this process of literally taking charge of children, taking them away from parents if they hold the wrong worldview, and welcome to the new world that we're in. Okay, so the question, who's going to be in charge, parents or the state? There is hardly a more critical question to ask, and when we have critical questions like this in our culture, there's always one place we go to get an answer, right? Unfortunately, it's not the Bible, okay? At least in our civic world, we go to the Supreme Court, okay? We have given them that power. Whether we should have or not, we in effect have. And so the question has come before the Supreme Court, not just once, but several times, and it has consistently answered that question of who is the primary authority in the life of children. And what have they said? They have said again and again and again that in fact parents are that authority. Parents are the deciders when it comes to the life of their children. The clearest case where that is expressed came from a case back in 1925 out of the state of Oregon. It's called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. Back in the early 20s, Oregon politics was dominated by a particular group of people, a particular ideology. And I think you'll be a little shocked to find out who that group is. It's the Ku Klux Klan. They had great sway in Oregon back in the early 20s, and they persuaded the state legislature to pass and the governor to sign a bill which said that if parents send their child to anything other than a government-run school, parents would be fined and they would be jailed. Okay? You may not step outside the bounds of an officially prescribed, government-prescribed education. Well, needless to say, that was upsetting to some people, so they instituted a lawsuit. It worked its way up through the courts, and in 1925, the Supreme Court said The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny, by that they mean parents, have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. Now that phrase, additional obligations, that sounds kind of squishy, okay? But what they meant by that was that whole list of things that education is supposed to accomplish. You know, does life have purpose? Does it have meaning? You know, are we just material creatures, or is there, you know, all of those things? Here the court clearly says that the state is not competent to make those decisions. Parents alone are. Okay? It's just as crystal clear as you could hope to have. And this is way back in 1925. So, okay, if parents, in fact, are the deciders, then one of the questions that immediately surfaces is, well, what do they have to decide between? What kinds of different schooling settings are there? Well, back in 1925, there probably was only two. You had your local district government-run school, and maybe you had a religious school. Catholic, might have been a LCMS school, but those were pretty much your only choices. These days, that universe of choice has expanded considerably. So now we have not only the traditional government-run, what we typically call public schools, which is a misnomer, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But now we have these things called charter schools, which are kind of quasi-governmental, but also where parents have much more influence. We have online schools, religious schools, as we all have had for a long time, independent private schools, the Blakes and Brecks of the world, those kinds of things. And of course, homeschooling has become quite popular. Somewhere between 3 and 5% of all students now are schooled at home. That, you know, has exploded over the last 20, 25 years. And this is not an exhaustive list either. There are other educational options as well. So when you ask parents, you know, if you had your druthers, there was nothing holding you back, what kind of school would you prefer your child or children attend? And consistently over many years, many different polls by many different polling organizations, consistently you find out that about 55% of parents say they would choose something other than the local district public school. Which of course means that 45% would still choose that, okay, and that's not insignificant. But you have a clear majority that would choose something else. So that then leads us to a mystery of sorts. If in fact parents are the deciders when it comes to the educational lives of their kids, and 55% of those parents say that they would choose something other than a traditional public school, then why do only 15% attend something other than a traditional public school? There's a gap there of 40% of parents who say, I really would like something other than a traditional public, but for some reason, I am still choosing a traditional public school. Okay? So that's not an insignificant percentage of parents. Now, you know, are there some reasons that parents would still ultimately choose something that is not their first choice? Yeah, and they're pretty good reasons. Geography certainly is one of them. I may want to send my child to a Lutheran LCMS elementary school, but if I live out in the middle of Wyoming, the nearest one may be 200 miles away. Not going to happen, okay? Not without some really heroic, extreme measures being taken. Or there are other reasons too. I don't know that it's as true in a metro setting as it is elsewhere, but certainly out in smaller towns, there is a great deal of social pressure brought to bear on parents to fall in line and essentially stipulate that they are full members of the community. And if you choose something other than the local public school, which they equate with the community, you have become a suspect person. And that gets communicated to parents in many and various ways, some subtle, some not so subtle. And ultimately, it's enough to dissuade many parents, and ultimately they send their child to the big public school. Okay? So those are two reasons that we can understand. But there is a third reason, and this is one that is not so easy to understand, and in fact, we would contend is in fact illegal, unconstitutional, or at least so we have contended over the years. Now, in order to understand how that could be the case, you first have to step back a little bit and try to grasp what is the arrangement that we have had, the social contract that we've had in this country with respect to education. Well, I would contend that this is kind of a good overview of it. First of all, we say that we all benefit by having all of our kids educated. Okay? We describe that as a common good. I don't think you'll find many people that would argue against that. Then we go on to say, because it is a common good, we all agree to be taxed to pay for this common good for all our kids. Okay? We may not like paying our taxes, but we understand that it's important that we do, and ultimately we do write the check or whatever. Okay, that taxing then allows us to pay for what we might call a good basic education for every child at no cost to parents, or essentially no cost. Okay? Good basic education. That's not a Breck education. That's not a elite kind of thing, but it's a good one. Okay? It produces good workers, good citizens, etc. All right, and then finally, the money to pay for this good basic level of education will follow the child to the school of the parents' choosing. Now we start to get into something that is a little more controversial, or at least it was. I think you all know that the charter school movement in the United States began right here in Minnesota. It's a little over 25 years old now. Before that movement, it would have been conceivable, and in fact many people did argue and said, no, the dollars cannot follow the child. They must go to the local public school district in which you reside, period. Okay, and they would back that up by saying, well, we're all a big melting pot, and unless all the kids go through the same regimented form of education, we can't be a unified community or culture, okay? Well, hard to say that that isn't true, because there was no other choice. Then came the charter school movement, and all of a sudden, the dollars did start to follow the child. Sometimes even outside of the public school district lines. Then came inter-district competition. And again, dollars follow the child. The precedent is now set. It's clear that this is true. And in fact, it continues to be the case except for, maybe you noticed there were some asterisks down at the bottom there, except for one category of parents and students, okay? That one category does not qualify. Everybody else does. And who is that one category? Well, it's the parents who desire and choose an education in a religious setting. Any other setting is fine. You can start a charter school and get students whose who will bring with them their state dollars. You can organize that charter school around languages. You can organize it around STEM. You can organize it around certain cultural things, around ethnic identities. Anything is fine with the state except a religious theme. Now, why is that? Does the state make this one exception because they have found that religious schools produce inferior products? Do religious schools produce less fit workers or not as competent as citizens? Is that what we have found? No, of course not. And in fact, when you look at all the studies, and there have been many, it makes a strong case the other way. That's not our reason for the conversation today. It is sufficient to say that they do at least as good a job as a local public school district does. All right. So then, does the government have may they just prefer to have people schooled non-religiously? May the government just prefer to have non-religious people? And therefore a non-religious society. Is that okay? Well, my guess is you would find a lot of people who would say emphatically, yes, that is okay. In fact, the government must do that. The government must have that preference. And very quickly out of their mouth will come the phrase, the separation of church and state. And in uttering that phrase, they think they have made a conclusive argument, which means they don't have to give any other justification for the government excluding this one group of people. Okay? So the question is, does the idea of the separation of church and state, does it really mean that? Well, first of all, of course, we have to remember that phrase and that concept is not part of our official governing documents, right? Not part of our Constitution, not part of the Declaration of Independence or anything else. Do you remember where it came from? A letter Thomas Jefferson wrote to, above all people, some Baptist pastors in Connecticut who were concerned that the church, as the government was taking shape, were concerned that the church was going to get frozen out of influence in this new culture, this new society that was forming. And Jefferson wrote this letter and used that phrase to assure the pastors that, oh no, they would be able to operate freely, that they would have every bit as much influence as everybody felt they should have. Don't worry about it. Well, of course, the phrase over the years has been just stood on its head so that it now means exactly the opposite of what Jefferson intended it to mean. And it entered into the legal system back in 1947 with a Supreme Court case called Everson. And since that time, it has taken on these mythic qualities where all you have to do is say this and all of a sudden the secular voice in the conversation wins, period. Okay? So, but we've never had anything to challenge that with in a legal vein. Okay? Well, speaking of legal veins, you know, our legalities, our legal system is based, of course, ultimately on our Constitution. So the question is, what does the Constitution have to say about this? Can the government treat educational choices of some parents differently simply because their choice is a religious one? Okay, does the Constitution speak to that? Well, yes, it does. And it shouts at us, no, you may not treat those decisions of some parents different than others. You must, in fact, treat everyone, both religious and non-religious, the same. Okay, it's that neutrality concept, which that comes as a surprise to us? No. We all assume that that's the way it is and the way it's supposed to be. And it in fact is in most areas of our life, but not in this one. Okay? This is a big exception. Okay, so what is the problem here? Why have we allowed this exception to exist in our public life? Well, it exists, we have this problem because the government has found itself somehow, and we don't have to worry about how we got there, but the government finds itself in a conflict of interest situation. Because the government is not just the collector and the dispenser of these dollars for a good basic education for all our kids, but because they are the primary provider of education, they therefore become the primary recipient of those dollars. What does this, there's a word that describes this situation. What is it? You all know it. It's called a monopoly. And in every area of our public life, whenever a monopolistic circumstance has developed, we as a culture have said that is bad for us. Okay? Because monopolies always do two things. What happens to the price of whatever is monopolized? It goes up. What happens to the quality of whatever is monopolized? It goes down. Just as sure as the sun rises in the east, that's what happens in a monopoly. Conversely, when you break up the monopoly, when you introduce competition, what happens? Price goes down and quality goes up. Again, this is not controversial. It's been proven many times. So back in the, I think, 20s, when Standard Oil had developed its monopoly to its zenith, even with all their power, economic power, political power, the government still broke them up. Okay, they broke up the trust, the monopoly. The same thing happened back in the 70s with AT&T, the communication monopoly. And I would suggest that we're seeing the initial stages of that in the internet, the domination of that part of our life, which is now essentially monopolized between 3 or 4 major players. But each one of them takes a specific slice. So really, it's only one player, that controls search engines and whatnot. Again, it's pretty well settled that when monopolies come into being, they are not healthy for us as a society, and we should do something to diminish their influence. Okay, so how could that be applied in the case of education? Well, the government could theoretically stop being a provider. We've been at this for 150 years. Not going to happen. Okay, the buildings belong to the local public school district, et cetera, et cetera. It's deeply ingrained in our culture. So that's not going to change. But are there some things that we could do to eliminate or lessen the degree of conflict of interest, lessen the monopolistic tendencies? And the answer is yes. And in fact, here we have a pretty good idea now of how you would go about doing that. Anytime you have a limited resource, you have fights develop over that. So for example, place yourself in your home. I don't know how many kids you have, but let's say you have 2. You have Billy and you have Sally, but you only have 1 cupcake. Okay, trouble. So what are you going to do? Well, you could deny it to both of them. Of course, that's not going to go over very big. Or you could conceivably hand a knife to Billy and say, Billy, here, I'm sorry. Let's make it Dick. Dick, you cut the cupcake and then choose which half you'd like, and Sally, you can have what's left. Well, you know what happens, particularly if that scenario is replayed over and over again. Pretty soon, Dick understands that he does not have to cut it just down the middle because he gets the first choice. Sally's going to get whatever's left. Okay, this is a recipe for domestic chaos and certainly not tranquility. So the other option, of course, is to hand Dick the knife, say, cut it in half, and then, Sally, you get the first choice, and then magically the cupcake gets cut right in the middle. And in fact, domestic tranquility rules. Life is good. Well, something like that would take place with respect to education. So that now the government, who still collects the dollars and determines how much they can afford to spend on a good basic education for all our kids, they still do that. But now parents get to select which school the child attends. The dollars follow that child, and there are no limitations. As long as those schools produce good workers and good citizens, the government has no interest whatsoever in what school the parent chooses. Okay? It's a simple solution. It has not been simple in practice to put that into place. But the fact of the matter is, we're already doing this, not just with charter schools, but with the PSEO, the post-secondary options. Kids who are juniors or seniors in high school can take their full allotment of dollars and go to any post-secondary school, university, including religious schools. There are no limitations there. So we're already doing it on that count. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, between public school districts, same thing. As long as there's room for your child in a specific place, the state is not upset by that. Okay, so what does the Constitution say then? Does it in fact say that this is wrong, that it is unconstitutional? Well, even though it seems pretty obvious that it was not right, that it was not a neutral way of approaching religious versus non-religious citizens, it was not until last summer, in the case of Trinity Lutheran versus Comer, that the court clearly said, this is not constitutionally acceptable. Okay? And in fact, it was what we typically call a landmark decision. Now, just real briefly, when you get into conversations about constitutions and legalities, in this field at least, you're going to focus primarily on the First Amendment of the Constitution, specifically the religion clauses, one called the Establishment Clause and the other the Free Exercise Clause. And then you tend to focus also on state constitutions, in particular clauses that exist there, which are very often called Blaine amendments. Very quickly, Establishment Clause essentially says that the government may not prefer or establish a particular religion. Not that it can't prefer religions or even treat them neutrally, just you can't pick a favorite. The Free Exercise Clause simply says that you have to allow each citizen to freely exercise their faith unless it causes some extreme harm to society or to other citizens. The government has no right to restrict that. And then there are these state Constitution amendments, Blaine amendments, which essentially say the state they ban the use of any public funds in support of what are called sectarian private schools. Now, there are about 38 states that have these clauses. Minnesota is one of them. And what's key here is to understand what is meant by the word sectarian. These days, we would tend to translate that word maybe just religious. But in fact, when these amendments were placed into the Constitution, sectarian had a much more specific meaning. It meant Catholic, okay? Because at the time these amendments were introduced, which was the middle 1800s, 1850, 60, 70, the Catholic Church was objecting to the fact that public schools were, in essence, Protestant schools. They taught the Bible, they read the Bible, there were prayers, and they were consistently Protestant in nature. Needless to say, Catholic parents objected to that, and they initially asked, well, we want our share of the money, we want the amount of a good basic education to be able to follow our kids to a Catholic school. A very reasonable request. However, it was not reasonable to the Protestants that controlled government. And so these amendments were placed in the constitutions to prevent that. One interesting twist here, as is often the case, this was not an idea that was clearly thought out and clearly and transparently discussed. In fact, the vast majority of the states that have this, including Minnesota, were essentially forced to have an amendment like this, or they would not be allowed into the Union. So much for this being a democratically thought through and introduced idea. It was not at all. But they exist, and for the last, 100 years in particular, 120, 30 years, these have been the primary things which have prevented dollars from following students to religious schools. All right, so now along comes the Trinity Lutheran case. Oh my goodness, we're late. Well, the Trinity Lutheran case, our congregation in Columbia, Missouri, what are the facts? Well, as I said, it had to do with playgrounds. Their preschool had a playground. On the playground, the cushioning material underneath the swings and jungle gyms and so forth was a pea rock, which at one time might have been an acceptable cushioner, but it doesn't cushion very much. And so the state of Missouri introduced a program where it improved two qualities of public life. First of all, they found that if they took old tires and ground them up and mixed an adhesive with them, they could produce a nice cushion material that was excellent for cushioning falls of kids. And it kept these tires from going into the public landfills, which were filling up, and it was a problem. So they introduced this program whereby any nonprofit in the state could apply to receive a grant to put this new material down. Trinity Lutheran Church and School made that application. They actually went to the government and said, can we really apply for this? And they said, yes, you may. You're a nonprofit. And they made the application following the selection criteria. They scored very highly. They scored number 5 out of the 40 that applied. They actually funded 15 of these grants at about $20,000 apiece. And it was at that point that somebody in state government said, oh, we made a mistake. We have a Blaine Amendment in our Constitution. You can't be a receiver of this. In fact, we should not even have allowed you to apply. Well, that was not just a disappointment to the congregation, but they said, this isn't right. Our constitutional rights seem to have been violated here. So there was a lawsuit instituted primarily under the auspices of ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. And if you don't know that group, you should. They are our greatest defenders. We need to support them enthusiastically. But under their auspices, this case made its way through the courts. And back last June, there was a 7-2 decision, a strong decision based both on the numbers, 7-2, and on the language that was used. And so the question they were answering was essentially, can you isolate one class of citizens and deny them a benefit that every other class of citizens gets when that the basis for that is religion? Okay, that's the question. Well, by a 7-2 margin, the court said, in using the Missouri Blaine Amendment to deny Trinity Lutheran the opportunity even to compete for what they call a neutral public benefit, that means something that everybody is eligible for, the state of Missouri has violated the Free Exercise Clause of the United States Constitution. This, my friends, is a big deal, a really big deal, okay? The court went on to say, well, here's the logic. When a state creates a neutral benefit program, that is a program intended to benefit everybody, it cannot show favoritism, either for secular or religious recipients. You have to treat them the same. Chief Justice Roberts kind of crystallized the whole thing when he said, to deny benefits to religious citizens that are offered to all other citizens simply because they are religious is odious to our Constitution and cannot stand. That is strong language. In fact, if I had my druthers, I'd have every one of our churches have the Ladies Guild crochet this, needle point it, and put it on our walls, because we've been waiting 150 years to hear words like this. Even though it's quite clear from the Constitution that that is the case, this is the first time that it was spoken by the Supreme Court. Big time deal.
It's interesting, however, it was not a unanimous decision.
That's correct. There are still forces, invested interests that don't want to allow this kind of equal treatment. But still, 7-2 is pretty strong. All right, so why was it a landmark decision? Well, first of all, because this is the first time that it was, they relied on the Free Exercise Clause. All the other school choice questions that have been answered over the last 20, 30 years have always asked the question, what may the government do? May the government help this particular school and not violate the Establishment Clause? They never asked the question, can we not grant this privilege because it might violate the Free Exercise Clause? This is the first time we relied on this part of the Constitution. And when we did, the outcome was very good. Okay, now, not only may the government allow dollars to flow to religious schools for playgrounds, it must allow it. If you allow all nonprofit organizations to compete for this, you can't single out religious nonprofits and say they're different. And now, not only must the government pay for the cost of playgrounds, it must also pay for the cost of the education that goes on in the building, because that too is a neutral benefit program, something intended for all our kids. Now, you notice there are a couple of question marks there, because the court in this Trinity Lutheran ruling stopped just a little bit short of saying that this basic idea therefore must apply to religious schools, what goes on inside the school building. They, in effect, spoke to it by, at the time this ruling was rendered, there were two other cases that the court was essentially holding in its back pocket, in which the question was, may the government or must the government allow tuition dollars or dollars to flow to the schools? And as soon as they rendered this decision, the Supreme Court the very next day sent those two other cases back to the states, who had said essentially separation of church and state means some people don't get their fair share. The Supreme Court sent it back and said, rethink that in light of what we just said in this ruling? Well, it's a long story, but those two cases, which would have swept in probably the next Supreme Court session and clarified this absolutely, they got sidetracked. Long story, sad story, political influence, money influence, all that kind of stuff. But, so we're still waiting for that follow-up Supreme Court case, which will absolutely, clearly identify the current restrictions as being unconstitutional. But that's coming, okay? Okay, so Trinity strongly suggests that the public funding of education, and not just playgrounds, is such a neutral program. No longer does public education mean the same as public schools. They are, you can't, the universe of schools that educate for the public good is larger than just your local public school district, or even public school districts plus charters, okay? The universe includes our religious schools. We educate for the public good just as much as the local public school district, okay? And secondly, no longer can you imply that just because the government is secular in nature, for which we should all give great thanks, but that does not mean that we must have a secular society. We have been very confused about that for a long time, okay? This case helps clarify that. Okay, so in the end, no longer may citizens, religious citizens, be treated as second class, that is, denied some benefit that everybody else gets. No longer does separation of church and state, no longer is that an example of neutrality. The court clearly said that is an act of hostility toward religion. No longer do religious parents have to, quote, pay a price that no one else has to pay when making educational decisions. And, very important, now parents and schools decide whether to accept government-collected funds. The government does not get to decide whether to offer them. Constitutionally, the government must offer it to everybody. If you decide as let's say a Lutheran grade school, that there is still too much danger in accepting those dollars, even though they're run through the parent, you can deny them. You don't have to accept them. The government, on the other hand, may not say, I won't offer them to you. Okay? Just a fundamental change has happened here. And finally, for our purposes as the church, allowing funds to flow to religious schools like every other school, the government will no longer give the impression that God lies outside the frame of reality, because that, in essence, is what the government is teaching every child in its system, where for 12 years, the most important thing in our life is ignored. That is a powerful statement, and it has dramatic results, okay? And I think we have seen those results in the empty pews that you see on Sunday morning. Okay, as a result of this, parents will be returned to their proper status as the primary authority of the child. All schools, public and private, will now become accountable to parents. This is good news, not just for parochial schools. It is good news for every school, every public school, because it is no longer beholden to the legislators in St. Paul, but rather beholden to, accountable to parents. That's a good thing for all of us. Regardless of whether you ultimately choose a public school education or a religious school education, this gets the order straight again and puts parents back where they should have been all along. And all this will happen if our education funding is brought into line with our Constitution, okay? Just because a court says something, doesn't mean it. The court doesn't have control of the IRS. The court doesn't have control of standing armies or anything like that to enforce its rulings. That needs to be worked out politically, and that's where we're at right now. And so that now is the point where we come into the picture, because we have to first understand what has happened, and we now have to become willing to talk to our neighbors about it, talk to our legislators about it. We need to be willing to engage confidently in the political process that will bring this to the right political end. And in the end, we'll no longer be allowing the government to hold a veto power over at least the vast majority of parents who economically cannot afford to make another choice. You're giving parents an unbiased choice, which they should have had all along. For us, why is this important? Why am I, as your representative, involved in this? Well, it is ultimately for the sake of the gospel. To remove this barrier to faith which is created when God is being treated consistently as being outside the frame of reality. And of course, a biblical warrant for this probably find no better than the great Shema, where we are called to invest daily, consistently with our children and reflect our understanding of the world and our God. So, I thank you for your kind attention, and I know I've run longer than I should have, but I think it's important.